Hi, I'm Rachel. 3 days ago, my father stood up at his own 60th birthday dinner, raised his glass in front of 40 people, looked straight at me, and said that my brother was his pride and I was his mistake. He said it laughing, like it was a toast, like it was cute. Everybody laughed with him. I laughed too, because that is what I have always done at that table. And 2 days after that, on a plain Sunday afternoon, while I was folding laundry in my apartment, my brother's bank called him to say that his business line of credit had lost its guarantor and that he had until the end of the month to either qualify on his own or pay down what he owed. That guarantor was me. It had been me for 6 years, and nobody at that table had known it, including him. My name is Rachel Bennett. I am 31 years old, and I work as a senior credit analyst at a community bank in Columbus, Ohio. I read loan files for a living. I know what a personal guarantee looks like from every angle, and for 6 years I had one sitting quietly on my own credit report that I never once mentioned at a family dinner. Because nobody ever asked, and because my father raised me to believe that fixing things without being thanked for it was simply what a good daughter did. My brother David owns a car restoration shop called Route 23 Custom Auto, out past the edge of Grove City. 6 years ago, when the bank that financed his build-out needed a real guarantor behind him, my name went on the paper. Not his. Mine. I used to think that being useful was the same thing as being loved. I don't think that anymore. Somewhere between the guarantee I signed at 25 and the toast my father gave 3 nights ago, I finally understood the difference, and understanding it cost me more than I expected it to. Have you ever been the one who quietly held everything together while somebody else got called the pride of the family? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from right now, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's lived this. And if this story pulls at something in you, do me a small favor and hit subscribe. It costs nothing, the button is right under this video, and it's honestly the only thing that keeps me able to keep telling stories like this one. Every person who subscribes tells me it's worth it to sit down and put the next one into words. I should tell you a little about who I was before any of this happened, because it matters. I was the kid who read the instructions before touching the toy. I was the kid who balanced her own checkbook at 14, because I liked the feeling of the numbers making sense. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State for finance, worked 2 jobs through college to cover the rest, and graduated with honors into a banking job I actually loved. The kind of job where you help a young couple qualify for their first house, and you go home that night feeling like you did something real. I was careful. I was competent. And in my family, none of that ever seemed to register as anything worth mentioning out loud. My father, Gary, spent 32 years on the assembly line at a parts plant off Route 62, the kind of job that wears down a man's knees and his patience in equal measure, and he retired 2 years ago with a pension and a pretty firm idea of what success was supposed to look like. To him, success looked like my brother. David had always been the one who could walk into a room and make people like him without trying, the one who could talk his way past a speeding ticket, the one who my father took to car shows on Saturday mornings while I stayed home doing homework nobody asked to see. When David brought home a C on a report card, my father called it a rough patch. When I brought home a B once in 10th grade calculus, he asked me what happened, in a tone that made it clear a B was a kind of failure he hadn't expected from me and didn't especially want to think about twice. That is the seed of this whole story, and I want you to hold on to it because everything else grows out of that one small, ordinary unfairness that so many people just live inside of without ever naming it. I still remember the exact afternoon it became a pattern I could actually name instead of just a feeling I carried around. I graduated from Ohio State on a Saturday in May. Top of my program, a small honors cord around my neck that I'd worked 2 part-time jobs and a lot of sleepless nights to earn. My father didn't come. David had a regional car show that same weekend, an amateur restoration competition 3 hours away in Cincinnati, and my father drove down to stand behind him in the gravel lot while judges walked around the bullet with clipboards. My mother came to my graduation alone, sat by herself in a folding chair in a stadium full of families, and clapped as loud as one person can clap when my name got called. I told myself, walking across that stage, that it was fine, that David's event had been booked first, that these things simply happen sometimes in a family with 2 kids and 1 set of parents. I believed my own excuse for almost a decade before I let myself actually look at how many times, across how many years, the coin always seemed to land on the exact same side. By the time I was 25, the pattern had a name in my own head, even if I never said it out loud. David was the pride. I was the girl who didn't cause problems. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the reliable one, the one nobody worries about, because it means nobody ever really looks at you either. You become furniture. Good furniture, sturdy furniture, the kind nobody thinks to thank because it never once wobbled. I used to sit at Sunday dinners and watch my father's face light up describing some half-finished plan of David's, a new engine he was rebuilding, a customer who wanted a full restoration, and I would wait for a single question about my own week, about the loans I'd approved, about the promotion I was working toward, and it rarely came, and when it did, it came thin like a formality he was checking off a list. David wasn't cruel about it. That's the part people don't expect when I tell this story. He wasn't some villain twirling a mustache. He was just a man who had been told his whole life that the sun rose because of him. And he believed it the way you believe the sky is blue without ever once checking. When his shop needed real money to grow past the stage of fixing neighbors' brakes in a rented garage, my father came to me, not to David, and asked me quietly, almost gently, if I would help my brother the way only I could help him. He said David's credit was too thin, his business too new, and that the bank wanted a real guarantor, someone with a strong file behind him. He said it would only be for a year or two, just until David built up enough history to stand on his own paper. He said, and I remember this exactly, that I was the responsible one, the one he could always count on, and that this was my chance to really help my brother the way a good sister would. I said yes within about 10 minutes of him asking. I want you to understand that I wasn't tricked into it in some dramatic way. I walked into it with my eyes wide open because I loved my brother, and because some small, hopeful part of me thought that this, finally, might be the thing that made my father look at me the way he looked at David. I sat across from a loan officer at First Miami Savings Bank, and I signed a continuing personal guarantee on an $85,000 business line of credit in my own name, against my own credit, for a garage build-out and a showcase vehicle David wanted to restore and park out front to draw customers in off the road. I remember the loan officer's small office that afternoon better than I remember most of the actual major days of my adult life. There was a fake plant in the corner, a framed photo of the bank president shaking hands with somebody at a ribbon cutting, and a stack of paper in front of me that the officer walked through page by page in a flat, practiced voice. The same voice I use now with my own customers. My father sat in the chair next to me the entire time, not saying much, occasionally nodding along like he understood the language of continuing guarantees and personal liability better than he actually did. When it was over and I signed the last page, he squeezed my shoulder once, hard, and said, "That's my girl," and I drove home that evening feeling, for the first time in years, like maybe I actually was. That car was a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro, silver with black stripes down the hood, the kind of car that stops traffic at a stoplight. David called it the Bullet. He spent the better part of a year bringing it back to life in the evenings after regular jobs were done. And when he finally rolled it out onto the lot with a hand-painted sign behind it that said, Route 23 Custom Auto, my father cried. I was standing right there. I remember it clearly because I had spent the 2 weeks before that quietly wiring extra payments toward the line of credit from my own savings account because David had fallen behind and I didn't want the bank calling the house asking questions my father would somehow turn into a referendum on my brother's character. Nobody at that unveiling knew that part. They just saw the car and the sign and my father's tears. And they clapped, and I clapped too. And I told myself it didn't matter that no one clapped for me. Every year after that, the story got told a little differently. At family gatherings, David became the boy who built a business from nothing, who worked with his hands, who took a risk and made it pay off through sheer grit. It is true that he worked hard. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters more to me than making him sound worse than he was. He put in long hours, he learned the trade properly, he treated his customers well, but the $85,000 that made the shop possible in the first place never once got mentioned as anything other than his own doing. My name never came up. Not at Thanksgiving, not at his engagement party, not the year he made his first real profit, and my father bought a round of drinks for the whole bar to celebrate his son, the business owner. I remember David's engagement party especially clearly, mostly because of a single conversation with my Aunt Carol, my father's sister, a kind woman who has never once meant to hurt anyone in her entire life and still managed to hurt me that evening without knowing it at all. She found me by the drinks table, hugged me, told me how proud the whole family was of David, how far he'd come with that little shop of his, and then, almost in the same breath, asked when I was going to settle down myself, find somebody, maybe think about starting a family of my own instead of just working all the time. I remember smiling and saying something light about not being in a rush, while the actual honest answer sat frozen behind my teeth. The answer that included $85,000 of my own credit quietly propping up the very engagement party we were standing in, paid for partly by a business I had made possible and would never be mentioned as any part of. I told myself repeatedly that it didn't matter, that love in my family simply looked like quiet duty instead of loud praise, and that someday the balance would even itself out on its own. The way I'd been taught patience always eventually pays for itself in a well-run ledger. I want to tell you honestly that I believed that for a long time, longer than I'm proud of. The loan for David's shop wasn't even the first time I'd quietly held up something in that house. 2 years before that, my parents' furnace died in the middle of a cold February, and my father, still a few years from retirement, didn't have the $2,200 sitting free to replace it without touching a savings account he was fiercely protective of. I paid the contractor directly in full and told my mother to tell him the home warranty had covered most of it. A small, harmless lie that let him keep believing he'd handled his own house himself. I did the same thing, smaller amounts, more times than I can accurately count, for a car repair here, a medical copay there, a plumber called on a Sunday when nobody wanted to admit the pipes had actually burst 2 days earlier. None of it was ever framed as help I gave. It just quietly happened, the way weather happens, and I was always the one holding the umbrella nobody else in the house seemed to notice was keeping them dry. If you've ever swallowed something like that down at your own family table, some quiet unfairness that everyone else seemed too comfortable to notice, I want you to know you're not imagining it, and you're not overreacting by still thinking about it years later. If any part of this is landing for you, subscribing costs nothing, and it genuinely helps me keep finding and telling stories exactly like this one, so if you haven't already, now's a good moment to tap that button before the next part. The years went by, the way years do when you're too busy being useful to stop and count them. I got promoted twice at my own bank. I bought a small condo near German Village with a down payment I saved myself dollar by dollar, while quietly still covering David's occasional shortfalls on a line of credit that was, on paper, entirely mine to answer for if he ever stopped paying altogether. Every year I told myself the same thing my father had told me at 25. That it was temporary, that David would refinance the line under his own name once the business had enough history behind it, that this was simply what families did for each other when one sibling had the means and the other had the dream. David never refinanced it. I brought it up exactly twice over those 6 years, carefully, without accusation. The way you'd raise a delicate subject with someone you love and don't want to hurt. The first time, he laughed and said the bank kept telling him it wasn't the right moment, rates were up, his file wasn't quite where it needed to be yet. The second time, 2 years later, he got a little defensive, said I was acting like the guarantee was some huge burden when really it cost me nothing since he always made the payments eventually. He wasn't entirely wrong about the payments. Mostly they came through, late sometimes, occasionally covered quietly by me when they didn't, but the line stayed open, stayed active. Stayed tied to my name and my credit and my risk every single day, whether he remembered that or not. I stopped bringing it up after that second conversation, not because I stopped caring, but because I could see exactly where it led, and I didn't want to be the sister who made a big deal out of something everyone else seemed to consider settled. In my family, the person who names the unfairness out loud is always somehow blamed for disturbing the peace. More than the unfairness itself is blamed for existing in the first place. I had learned that lesson early, and I had learned it well. My father's 60th birthday landed on a Saturday in the middle of summer, and my mother rented the community hall near their church for it, the kind of hall with folding tables and the little stage where the DJ sets up. Big enough for 40 or so people, family and old co-workers from the plant, and a handful of David's regular customers who'd become something like friends over the years. My mother, Lauren, spent 2 weeks planning the menu and the decorations the way she does everything, carefully and quietly, and without ever once asking anyone else to help carry the weight of it. I drove in from Columbus that afternoon with a bakery box balanced on my passenger seat. A cake I'd ordered myself because I know it's my father's favorite, yellow cake with real buttercream. And I want you to notice that detail, because it tells you something about how I still showed up for him even then, still tried, still hadn't given up, hoping the effort would eventually be seen. The hall was full by 7. David arrived in the Bullet, of course, parked it right up front where everyone walking in would pass it, and spent the first 20 minutes fielding compliments on the restoration from men my father used to work with on the line. His wife, Brittany, stood next to him glowing, telling anyone who'd listen how proud she was of what he'd built from absolutely nothing. I remember hearing that phrase, from absolutely nothing, and feeling something small and familiar tighten in my chest, the way it always did. And I remember choosing again to let it pass without comment, because that was the choice I always made, and because it was my father's night, and because making a scene had never once in my life gotten me anything but blamed. I sat at a table near the back with my mother and a couple of cousins, close enough to watch the whole room, but far enough from the center of it that nobody expected much from me besides polite conversation, which was exactly how most gatherings in my family had always worked. At one point, a man I recognized as one of my father's old shift supervisors leaned over and asked what I did for a living, and when I told him I worked in commercial banking, he nodded politely, said that's nice, and turned right back around to ask David another question about horsepower. I don't say that to sound bitter. I say it because it was such an ordinary, small moment, the kind that happens 100 times over the course of one evening and means almost nothing on its own. And it was only years of those small moments stacked one on top of another that finally added up to something heavy enough to notice. Dinner came and went, pleasantly enough. My father worked the room the way he always does at these things, shaking hands, laughing loudly at his own jokes, clearly enjoying being the center of a room built entirely around him for one evening. Around 8:30, my mother dimmed the overhead lights and someone wheeled out the cake, and my father stood up with a glass of wine in his hand to say a few words, the way fathers do at their own birthday parties when they've had just enough to drink to feel sentimental in front of a crowd. He talked for a few minutes about gratitude, about the plant, about my mother's patience with him over 35 years of marriage, and the room laughed in all the warm, familiar places. Then he turned toward David, put a hand on his shoulder, and started talking about the shop, about the Camaro out front, about watching his son build something real with his own 2 hands out of nothing but sweat and nerve. His voice caught a little. People at the tables near me were dabbing their eyes. And then, still looking mostly at David, but glancing just briefly in my direction, he said the words that are the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. He said his son was his pride, and then, almost as an afterthought, as if it were the punchline to a joke everyone already understood, he gestured toward me and said that I was his mistake. The room laughed. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I have, over and over, since that night, 40 people who have known me my whole life, people who watched me grow up careful and kind and hardworking, heard my own father call me a mistake at his birthday party, and the room laughed gently, the way you laugh at a joke you've maybe heard some version of before and stopped questioning a long time ago. My mother looked down at her plate. Brittany gave a small, uncomfortable smile and looked away. David actually laughed too. Not cruelly, just easily, the way you laugh when a joke lands near you, and you don't think too hard about who it's landing on. I laughed as well. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because it matters to the rest of this story. I laughed, I raised my own glass a half-inch off the table, and I let the moment pass, exactly the way I had let every smaller version of that same moment pass for the last 20 years. Something in me had gone very still and very quiet, the particular kind of quiet that isn't calm at all, the kind that's actually just shock wearing calm's clothes. I finished my slice of cake. I helped my mother clear plates afterward. I hugged my father goodbye at the end of the night and told him happy birthday, and he squeezed my shoulder and said I was a good girl, as if the two things, the mistake and the good girl, could sit comfortably in the same sentence without either of us noticing the contradiction. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, because I think some of you already know exactly the silence I'm describing. It's the silence of deciding in real time that keeping the peace matters more than defending yourself, because you've learned through years of small evidence that defending yourself only gets you labeled difficult, while staying quiet at least keeps you inside the family instead of outside it. If that's ever been your silence too, this is exactly the reason I keep making these videos, to say it out loud for people who couldn't say it out loud themselves at the time. And if it means something to you, hitting subscribe helps me keep doing that. It's completely free, and it's genuinely the only reason I'm able to keep sitting down and finishing stories like this one instead of letting them stay quiet too. I drove the 40 minutes back to my condo that night with the radio off, which is unusual for me because I usually can't stand silence in a car. I kept hearing the word mistake in my father's voice, in that light joking tone. The tone that somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted it, because a shout you can dismiss as anger, but a joke means he actually believes it, comfortably, easily enough to say it in front of a room and expect a laugh. The drive back to Columbus took me right past the plant where my father spent 32 years of his life, dark and quiet at that hour, except for a single security light over the main gate, and I remember slowing down almost without meaning to, looking at that building the way you look at something that explains a person even when it can't excuse them. My father built his entire sense of worth inside a place that measured a man by what he produced with his hands and how loud his supervisor's praise was on a good week. He never once had the language for a daughter who produced something quieter, spreadsheets and credit files and other people's approved mortgages. Work that didn't leave grease under your fingernails or a shining car in a parking lot for everyone to admire. I'm not sure that excuses what he said at that table. I've decided it doesn't have to. Understanding where a wound comes from and forgiving the person who keeps reopening it are two entirely separate decisions, and I was only ready that night to make the first one. I didn't cry when I got home, which surprised me a little. I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time instead, turning the evening over in my head the way you turn over a stone, looking for the crack in it. And somewhere around midnight, still sitting there in the dark, a specific practical thought arrived that had nothing to do with feelings at all. I thought about the guarantee. I thought about the folder in my file cabinet with First Miami Savings Bank's letterhead on it, 6 years old now, sitting exactly where I'd filed it the day I signed it. I thought, with the same clear professional part of my brain I use every single day at work, that I actually knew, better than almost anyone in that room, exactly what kind of document that was, and exactly what my rights inside it were. I want to tell you honestly that what happened next wasn't revenge, at least not the way people usually mean that word. I didn't want to hurt anybody. I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to simply stop protecting people who had never once protected me, and there's a real difference between those two things, even if they can look similar from the outside. If you've ever reached that exact point, the point where you stop trying to earn love through quiet sacrifice and start simply asking what's actually fair, I think you'll understand everything that happened over the following 2 days. And if you're the kind of person who needed to hear that it's okay to reach that point, please subscribe before we keep going. It doesn't cost you anything, and it tells me these stories are actually helping someone out there, which is honestly the only thing that keeps me writing them down. I got up off the couch a little after 1 in the morning and pulled the folder out of my file cabinet. I hadn't looked at it in probably 2 years, not since the second and last time I'd brought up refinancing with David. I sat at my kitchen table in my pajamas with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside me and read the whole continuing guarantee agreement from the first page to the last, the way I read every document at work, slowly, twice, with a pen in my hand, even though I wasn't marking anything on this particular copy. There was a clause on page 4 I remembered vaguely, but had never had a real reason to think hard about, because I'd never had a real reason to want out. It was a standard termination of future advances clause, the kind you find in a lot of continuing commercial guarantees. allowing the guarantor to send written notice to the lender terminating their liability for any future draws on the line, effective a set number of days after the bank received it. My existing exposure up to that point would still technically stand until settled, but the open-ended risk, the part where David could keep drawing against a credit line backed by my name indefinitely without my ongoing consent, without so much as a conversation, that part I had the legal right to shut the door on myself in writing whenever I decided to. I sat with that fact for a long time in the quiet of my kitchen. It felt less like discovering a weapon and more like discovering a door I hadn't realized had been unlocked the entire time I'd been standing in front of it feeling trapped. The next morning, a Sunday, I texted my supervisor at the bank, a woman named Jessica Coyle, who has mentored me since my first year in the industry and who has forgotten more about commercial lending than most people ever learn. I didn't tell her everything, not at first, just that I had a personal question about a continuing guarantee I was a party to, completely outside of work, and could she spare 20 minutes? She called me within the hour because that's who Jessica is, and I laid it out for her plainly, the loan, the years, the birthday dinner, all of it in the flattest voice I could manage. Jessica was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said something I've thought about every day since. She said that what my family had done to me had a name in the industry, informally at least. They called it the forever guarantor, the family member who signs once as a favor and ends up holding risk for a business they don't run and don't profit from, sometimes for the rest of their working life, simply because nobody with the actual obligation ever circles back to release them properly. She told me plainly that I had every right under that clause to terminate my liability for future advances, that it was standard, defensible, entirely legal, and that no reasonable person in banking would call it anything other than a person finally protecting her own credit. She said the only real decision left for me to make was whether I was ready to actually do it. Jessica told me something else that morning too, something quieter, that she mentioned almost in passing, but that stayed with me longer than the legal explanation did. She said she'd carried something similar once herself, years before I ever met her, a car loan for a younger cousin she'd co-signed in her 20s that had taken her almost a decade to fully untangle, and that the hardest part had never been the paperwork. The hardest part, she said, was giving herself permission to stop being the reliable one for exactly one relationship in her life, without believing that doing so made her a worse person than she'd been the day before. She said permission was the whole battle, the legal part was just filing. I sat at my kitchen table holding the phone a little tighter after she said that, because it was the first time another adult had ever named out loud the exact shape of what I'd been carrying. I told her I was. She helped me draft the letter that same afternoon, sitting with me over the phone while I typed, making sure every line matched the exact language in my agreement so there could be no argument later about whether the notice was valid. It was a short letter in the end, barely half a page, addressed to First Miami Savings Bank's commercial lending department, stating plainly that I, Rachel Ann Bennett, was exercising my right under Section 4 of the continuing guarantee dated 6 years earlier to terminate my liability for any future advances on the business line of credit associated with Route 23 Custom Auto, effective the date specified in the agreement. I drove to the post office Monday morning before work and sent it certified, with a return receipt requested because I wanted proof, clean and undeniable, that the bank had received it and on exactly what date. I remember standing at that counter in my work clothes, coffee in one hand, envelope in the other, feeling strangely calm, the way you feel right before a decision stops being a decision and simply becomes a fact in the world. I didn't call David. I didn't call my father. I went to work that day and approved 4 ordinary loan applications and helped a first-time homebuyer understand her closing disclosure, and I didn't tell a single person at my own bank what I'd mailed that morning because it wasn't a work matter, it was mine. The bank received the letter on a Wednesday, according to the return receipt that came back to me 8 days later, with a signature I didn't recognize scrawled across the bottom. Under the terms of the agreement, my liability for future advances terminated 30 days after that date. What I hadn't fully anticipated, even knowing the document as well as I did, was how quickly the bank's own internal review process would move once a personal guarantor formally exited a commercial line of credit carrying an outstanding balance as large as David's had grown to over 6 years. Route 23. Custom Auto's line was sitting at just over $61,000 drawn against the original $85,000 limit when my letter landed on someone's desk at First Miami Savings. Under their own risk policy, a continuing line losing its sole personal guarantor triggered an automatic credit review, and that review meant the account went on hold for any new draws immediately. While David was given a set window to either qualify for the line entirely under his own credit, standing completely alone for the first time in 6 years, or bring the balance down to a level the bank was comfortable carrying on his file without me behind it. I found all of this out the way most of my family found it out, which is to say, mostly secondhand, in fragments over the following 72 hours. David called my father first on a Sunday evening in a voice my mother later described as sounding like a much younger man than 35. He told him the bank had frozen his line, that some kind of guarantee had been pulled without warning, that he had no idea what was going on or who could have done something like that to him right when the shop was finally starting to turn a real profit. My father, who has never once in his life dealt calmly with a problem he didn't immediately understand, called the bank himself the next morning, pretending to be David for reasons that still make me shake my head, and got exactly nowhere because banks do not discuss commercial accounts with people who are not on them, not even fathers who raised their voice at 3 different branch employees before finally hanging up. By Monday afternoon, my father called me. His voice was tight, controlled in the particular way that meant he was more rattled than angry, at least at first. He asked if I knew anything about problems with David's line of credit, said something strange had happened with the bank, said David was in a panic and he didn't understand why. I told him honestly that I did know something about it and that David needed to look carefully at the paperwork the bank had sent him because it would explain everything. I didn't say more than that. I wasn't trying to be cruel or cryptic. I simply believed, the way I still believe now, that this particular truth needed to come from the actual documents and not from my mouth, because documents don't have a tone people can accuse of being petty or jealous or bitter. I remember standing in my own kitchen while my father talked, phone pressed to my ear, looking out the window at the little courtyard behind my condo, and feeling a strange, almost physical calm settle over me instead of the panic I might have expected. I wasn't scared of what was coming. I had read that document more carefully than anyone else in my family ever would, and I already knew exactly what David was going to find once he actually sat down and looked at the paperwork instead of just panicking about a frozen account. Part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, but won't pretend didn't exist, was almost relieved that the truth was finally going to have to explain itself in writing on a bank's own letterhead, where nobody could argue with the tone of it or accuse me of exaggerating. David found the notice 2 days later, buried under invoices on the passenger seat of his truck, a formal letter from First Miami Savings Bank explaining that the line's guarantor, listed plainly as Rachel Ann Bennett, had exercised her contractual right to terminate liability for future advances, and that, as a result, the account was under mandatory review. He read it standing in his own garage, according to Brittany, who told me later that his face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 30 seconds. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked, she said, almost like fear. And then, finally, a kind of stillness she'd never seen on him before, the stillness of a man realizing that a story he had told himself for 6 straight years had just quietly stopped being true in front of his own eyes. He drove straight to my parents' house with the letter still in his hand and put it down on the kitchen table in front of my father, without a word. My mother told me later that my father picked it up, read the first line, then the second, and had to sit down at his own kitchen table, the same table where 3 nights earlier he had called me his mistake in front of 40 people and read the word guarantor 3 separate times before he understood what he was actually looking at. What my father was looking at in black and white on a bank's own letterhead was proof that the $85,000 loan behind his son's entire business, the loan behind the garage build-out, behind the Camaro he'd cried over the day it rolled out onto the lot, behind 6 years of toasts calling David a self-made success who had built something from absolutely nothing, had never for one single day been backed by David's own credit at all. It had been backed by mine, silently, the entire time, without a single public word of thanks, right up until the week I finally stopped. My mother called me that same evening, her voice small and careful in a way I recognized instantly, because it's the voice she uses when she's about to ask me to smooth something over that isn't mine to smooth. She asked if I could come by Thursday, said your father wants to talk to you, said it gently, like an invitation instead of what it actually was, which was a summons. I said yes, because some habits take longer to unlearn than others, and because I genuinely wasn't trying to hide from what I'd done. I had nothing to hide. I had simply stopped hiding what had already been true for 6 years. I got to my parents' house Thursday evening and found all 4 of them already at the kitchen table. My father, my mother, David, and Brittany. The same table, the letter sitting in the middle of it like a 5th person nobody wanted to look at directly. My father didn't yell when I walked in, which somehow felt worse than yelling would have. He just looked at me, tired and older than I'd ever seen him look, and asked why I would do something like this to my own brother. Why now? Why so suddenly? Why without a single word of warning to any of them first? I sat down across from him and answered as plainly as I knew how. I said I hadn't done anything to David. I had simply stopped guaranteeing a debt that was never mine to carry indefinitely, on a business I didn't own, didn't run, and had never once been thanked for keeping alive. I said I had signed that guarantee 6 years ago because he asked me to, and because David promised more than once to refinance it under his own name within a year or two. And that year or two had quietly become 6, and nobody, not my father, not my brother, had ever once circled back to release me from it. I said I hadn't told anyone, not even them, that 3 nights earlier, at his birthday, in front of 40 people, he had called David his pride and called me his mistake, and that the very same week the bank he was so confused about had called to say that his mistake was the only reason his pride's business had ever had a garage, a truck, or a Camaro in the first place. Nobody at that table said anything for a long moment. Brittany was the first to speak quietly, asking David if it was true, if I really had been the one behind the loan the whole time, and David, to his credit, didn't lie. He said yes. He said he'd meant to refinance it years ago and just kept not getting around to it, kept telling himself there was no rush since I'd never complained. My father sat very still, looking down at the letter, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. The slow, uncomfortable arithmetic of a man realizing that the pride he had built an entire identity around had been standing, quietly, invisibly, on the exact daughter he had spent years calling his mistake. I didn't raise my voice at that table. I didn't list every slight from the last 20 years, or demand an apology, or ask anyone to admit out loud that they'd been wrong about me. I simply told them the truth, once, clearly, and then I sat there and let the silence do whatever work it was going to do on its own, because I had learned, finally, that I no longer had to manage everyone else's feelings about a fact I hadn't invented, only lived inside of quietly for 6 long years. The practical consequences landed fast, the way real ones usually do, without any of the drama you'd expect from a scene like the one at that kitchen table. David had 45 days from the date of the bank's letter to either qualify for the remaining balance entirely on his own credit or bring in a new guarantor the bank would actually approve. His own file, 6 years into running the shop, still wasn't strong enough on its own to carry $61,000 outstanding without support behind it, not with the truck payment and the equipment loans he was already carrying on top of it. For the first time in the whole story, it was my father, not me, who sat down across from a loan officer at First Miami Savings and signed his own name onto his son's line of credit, using the equity in the house he and my mother had owned outright for 11 years as the collateral behind it. Nobody made a toast about that one. There was no birthday dinner, no room full of 40 people clapping, no cake. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a bank branch off Stringtown Road. quietly, the way most real financial responsibility actually happens, and my father drove home afterward and didn't mention it to anyone outside the immediate family for weeks. When my mother finally told me, almost apologetically, that your father co-signed for your brother now, I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt something closer to relief, the plain, unglamorous relief of watching a weight finally land on the person who had always gotten the credit for carrying it. David kept the shop. He kept the Camaro too, though he told my mother he'd thought seriously about selling it that first week before the numbers settled, and he realized he could manage the new terms if he cut back on a part-time detailer he'd hired the year before and took on more of the labor himself again. The way he had at the very beginning, I think, in a strange way, that going back to doing more of the work with his own hands was the closest thing to growth I saw in him through any of this. He didn't call me to thank me, I want to be honest about that, instead of tying it up neater than it actually was. What he did about 2 weeks after that kitchen table conversation was call and ask, carefully, almost hopefully, whether I would consider going back on the guarantee now that things had calmed down, since apparently his father co-signing had made the bank nervous about relying so heavily on one man's home equity at his age. I told him no. I said it kindly, without any edge in my voice, but I said it clearly enough that there was no room left for a follow-up conversation about it later. I told him I loved him and that I was proud, genuinely, of how hard he'd worked to build something real, but that I was done being the invisible name behind his business, and that if he needed a guarantor going forward, that conversation belonged between him and a bank, or between him and our father, not with me by default, simply because I had once been willing and quiet about it. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said, "Okay," and that was the whole conversation. It was the first time in my life a conversation like that had ever actually ended where I wanted it to end, instead of where guilt usually dragged it. My father tried once more, too, about a month later over the phone on a Sunday in a gentler tone than I expected, asking if there wasn't some way I could just help out again temporarily, just until David got back on his feet properly. Said family was supposed to take care of family, and he didn't understand why I was suddenly making it so complicated. I told him it wasn't complicated at all. I told him I had taken care of family quietly for 6 straight years without a single word of thanks, and that the one time I asked indirectly, through my own silence and my own sacrifice, to simply be seen as part of what made David's success possible, I got called a mistake at his birthday party in front of 40 people instead. I told him I would always love him and David, but that I would no longer carry financial risk for either of them without it being fair, visible, and mutual, and that this wasn't punishment, it was simply the ordinary boundary any adult deserves to have honored. My Aunt Carol called me too, a couple of weeks after word had gotten around the wider family the way it always eventually does. She said she'd heard some of what happened from my mother, said she felt terrible about the comment she'd made at David's engagement party all those years ago, the one about settling down that she probably didn't even remember making until my mother reminded her of it in the context of everything else. She told me she'd always just assumed David was the one holding the family together financially, because that was the story everyone told and retold so many times it had hardened into something that felt like fact. She said she was sorry for never once asking me a real question about my own life at any of those gatherings, and asked, a little sheepishly, if I'd like to get coffee sometime, just the two of us, so she could actually get to know me instead of the quiet niece she'd apparently spent 20 years standing next to without seeing. My mother, in her own quiet way, was the one who actually apologized. She drove out to my condo about 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, unannounced, with a container of the leftover yellow cake she'd frozen a slice of from that night, and she sat at my little kitchen table and told me she'd known, for years, roughly what I'd been doing for David, and that she'd never said anything because she didn't know how, and because your father doesn't like being told he's wrong about anything, and she was sorry, plainly, without excuses, in a way my father still hasn't quite managed, even now. I cried a little that afternoon, the first tears I'd let myself have through the entire thing, not because of the guarantee or the bank or even David, but because it was the first time in longer than I could remember that someone in my family had simply said, out loud, that they saw what I had actually been carrying. David and I talk now, occasionally, mostly small things. A text about a birthday, a quick call when our mother's not feeling well and needs one of us to drive her to a doctor's appointment. It's not warm in the way it used to look from the outside back when he was the pride and I was the quiet one clapping in the crowd, but I think it might actually be more honest than anything we had before. Last month, he sent me a photo of a young guy who'd just started apprenticing under him at the shop, said the kid reminded him of himself at that age. Eager and a little cocky, and convinced he could fix anything with enough patience. I told him that was a good thing to be reminded of. And I meant it, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, a conversation between us didn't leave me quietly doing math in my head about what it was costing me to have it. 2 months after all of it, I got promoted to team lead over commercial underwriting at my own bank, a job I had been quietly working toward for almost 2 years before any of this happened, entirely on my own merit, with my own name on my own file, finally clean of a 6-year-old guarantee that had been sitting on my credit report the entire time, weighing down my own debt-to-income ratio in ways I hadn't even fully appreciated until it was gone. My credit score climbed almost 40 points within a single reporting cycle once that liability came off. It is a strange, quiet kind of justice watching your own numbers finally reflect the actual risk you're carrying instead of a burden you took on for someone else's dream. If any part of tonight's story sounds like your own life, the quiet fixing the invisible risk, the family that only seems to notice you when something finally breaks, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. It's completely free. It takes about 2 seconds. And it's genuinely the reason I'm able to keep sitting down every week and turning stories like this one into something real for people who need to hear that they're not alone in carrying what they carry. Family dinners since then have been smaller and further apart, and honestly, quieter in a better way than they used to be. My father hasn't apologized to me directly, not in so many words, though at a cookout in August I heard him correct one of his old co-workers who joked about David building the shop from nothing, heard him say, quietly. Actually, his sister helped him get it started and it wasn't much. 3 words tucked into a sentence nobody else at that cookout probably even noticed, but I noticed, and it was the closest thing to being seen that I think my father may ever be capable of giving me. I've decided that has to be enough for now, not because I've given up hoping for more, but because I've stopped needing it in order to know my own worth. I started seeing a therapist about 6 weeks after the birthday dinner, something I'd resisted for years because a part of me believed that needing help was just one more way of being the family's problem instead of its fixer. The first thing she asked me, in our very first session, was to describe what fairness felt like in my body. Physically, and I remember sitting there in that small office not knowing how to answer, because I genuinely couldn't recall the last time I had felt it. We spent months slowly working backward through report cards and graduations and a loan officer's small office with a fake plant in the corner, and somewhere in the middle of all that work I finally understood that the version of me who signed that guarantee at 25 hadn't been foolish or naive. Or she had simply been a young woman doing the only thing she'd ever been taught love required of her, and she deserved compassion for that, not embarrassment. I've thought a lot in the months since that birthday dinner about what I actually wanted out of any of it. I never wanted the bank to call David out of spite. I never wanted my father to sit at a branch office and sign his own name onto something out of guilt. If either of those things had somehow been avoidable while still letting me finally put my own name back on my own credit file, I would have taken that quieter path in a heartbeat. What I wanted, the entire time, was simpler and smaller than revenge, and it took me 31 years to be able to say it plainly even to myself. I wanted to stop being the invisible reason somebody else's life worked without a single person in the room ever having to know my name. I am not the mistake. I never was. I was the foundation nobody in that family ever thought to look at, the thing holding weight quietly underneath everybody else's version of success. And I have learned, the hard way, that a foundation, when it finally decides to move even a little, brings down everything that was standing on top of it, pretending it had built itself. That's not a threat. It's just physics, the same kind of physics that governs a garage build-out or a business line of credit or a family that has spent 20 years mistaking silence for weakness. If you are the one in your family who fixes things quietly, who covers the shortfall nobody else sees, who gets called responsible instead of loved, I want you to hear this clearly, because I needed to hear it myself for a very long time before I finally believed it. Being useful is not the same thing as being valued. You are allowed to stop carrying weight that was never fairly yours to carry, even if you're the only one who ever notices you're carrying it. You don't owe anyone your silence just because you've been quiet about it for years already. The people who actually love you will still love you on the other side of a boundary. The ones who don't were only ever loving what you did for them, and that is a painful thing to learn, but it is better to know it than to spend another 6 years finding out, slowly. I still work at my bank in Columbus. I still see my family, at holidays mostly, sometimes at a Sunday dinner when my mother calls and asks softly if I have time to come by. I still love my brother, and I think given enough years, he might actually become the kind of man who deserves the credit he's always been given so freely. On his own paper this time, in his own name, the way it should have been from the very beginning. My father is 61 now. I don't know if he'll ever say the word sorry to me directly, in those exact letters, in that exact order. But I know what I know about myself now, clearly, without needing his permission to know it, and that is worth more to me than any toast he could ever give at any birthday table again. If this story meant something to you tonight, whether you're the fixer in your own family or you just needed to hear that someone else understands what that particular silence feels like, please take a second and subscribe. It cost you absolutely nothing. It takes about as long as this sentence, and it is the entire reason I get to keep sitting down and telling stories like mine for people who are still sitting quietly at their own version of that table. Thank you for listening tonight, truly. Wherever you're hearing this from, I hope you go into tomorrow just a little lighter than you came into today, and I hope, if nobody has told you yet, that you know you were never anybody's mistake either.